The Case of the Broken Hourglass. Inspector Purbright. BBC crime drama. Flaxborough on that Wednesday morning seemed determined to remain ordinary. The sky held a colour that could not be named, neither blue nor grey, but the muted tone of a town that prefers not to be noticed. Market Street stirred to its routine, the postmistress unlocking her door, Mr. Swithers adjusting his newspaper stand, and the scent of bacon from the Albion Cafe curling into the air like an afterthought. At precisely 9:30, an hourglass shattered. It happened with an oddly deliberate sound, not the sudden crash of accident, but the quiet surrender of something long prepared to break. A thin crack, a sigh, and the curved glass of Luff's curiosity shop fell inward, scattering pale sand over the display of brass compasses and maritime trinkets. The sand moved slowly, hesitantly, as if uncertain of its purpose now that containment was gone. Mrs. Poole, who had been passing with her shopping basket, dropped her bag of apples. She later insisted that she heard her late husband's name whispered just before the glass broke. Others merely heard the sound of shattering and the soft hum of gossip beginning to take form. By 10 o'clock, the shop front was ringed by onlookers, respectable, concerned, and secretly delighted. Flaxborough's calm had cracked, and there was nothing quite like it to stir the morning tea. Mr. Luff himself appeared from within, a man of peculiar neatness, his spectacles fogged and his expression politely appalled. He apologized to no one in particular and began sweeping sand into a small dustpan. He declined assistance, though several offers were made, and muttered something about vibrations from the church bell. At the police station, Inspector Purbright looked up from his desk as the news arrived in the usual roundabout way. A telephone call from Miss Teatree, prefaced by her firm assurance that she was not one for gossip. "An hourglass, Inspector," she declared, "exploded right there in the window. A most unchristian object in my view, and now it's come to grief." Purbright listened with mild attention, pen poised above his report on bicycle registration. "No injuries, I hope?" "Only to decency," said Miss Teatree, and rang off before elaborating. Purbright replaced the receiver, smiled faintly, and gazed through his office window. The church clock opposite the station had stopped at 9:30. He waited, listening for its next chime, but none came, a peculiar synchronicity perhaps. Yet such coincidences had a way of drawing his attention, quiet ones especially. By afternoon, the event had assumed its proper place in the hierarchy of village scandal, beneath the recent flower show controversy but above the missing cat. Still, Purbright strolled past the curiosity shop after lunch for the pleasure of confirming its existence. Mr. Luff was on his knees behind the counter, collecting fragments of glass with tweezers. He looked up briefly, nodded, and resumed his careful work. The window was already boarded, a temporary wooden patch that did not quite align with the frame. Through the gap, a sliver of light cut across the floor like a misplaced sundial. Purbright lingered a moment, long enough to see that behind the counter sat an empty stand, a label still attached. "Victorian hourglass, c. 1860, measures exactly 1 hour. There was no price. He moved on, hands in pockets, mind unhurried but attentive. Time in Flaxborough, he thought, had paused for a reason, and sooner or later someone would be along to wind it up again. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into its favourite occupation, the delicate art of interpretation. The shattering of an hourglass, after all, could not remain a mere accident in a place so well supplied with imagination. From one window to another, through lace curtains and half-closed doors, theories drifted like wood smoke. Mr. Luff's name travelled first, then multiplied into versions of itself. In one retelling he was ruined, in another bewitched. By the time gossip reached the grocer's counter, it had acquired the embellishment of a late-night visitor and a quarrel overheard by no one in particular. At the Albion Cafe, the event was recounted for the 7th time that morning. Miss Teatree presided over her corner table, the authority of long experience lending gravity to her every pause. She stirred her tea as though consulting it for evidence. "I said from the first," she announced, "that the thing had an aura. That hourglass was never meant to be handled. Spiritualist object, I'd wager. They do say it came from the estate of that medium, Mrs. Greaves, the one who predicted her own washing day." Her companion, Mrs. Poole, looked uncertain.
But surely, Miss Teatree, it's only sand and glass." Miss Teatree leaned forward.
"You'd think so. But if you listen, truly listen, you'll find that such objects remember what they've measured. Grief, for instance. It lingers." The cafe door opened, admitting a rush of fog and the faint sound of the church bell testing its silence. Inspector Purbright stepped in, removing his hat with his usual mild courtesy. The conversation at once softened, like a curtain drawn across an untidy room. He ordered tea and a currant bun, then found a table beside the window. His gaze, calm and distant, wandered across the street to Luff's boarded window. The patch of timber was already weathering, the edges curling slightly from the damp. Miss Teatree, unable to bear unaddressed curiosity, rose with deliberate nonchalance and crossed to him.
"You've heard, of course, about the explosion," she began. Purbright looked up, smiling faintly. "Explosion?"
I understood it was more of a sigh. "A sigh, Inspector, can be deadly if it comes from the wrong source." He inclined his head. "I'll make a note of it. Perhaps we should investigate all local expressions of disappointment." Miss Teatree pursed her lips, defeated only momentarily. "They say young Derek Luff's been seen in the company of bookmakers. One wonders if the poor hourglass was an unpaid pledge." "An unusual form of collateral," Purbright murmured. "But Flaxborough does enjoy variety," she returned to her table, triumphant enough to have contributed something that sounded official. Purbright finished his tea slowly, watching the street through the fogged glass. The rhythm of the town continued, a child dragging a stick along the iron railings, the butcher's boy whistling, a milk float humming by. Yet beneath these sounds he sensed a faint dissonance. Something in the air had altered since yesterday. He left a coin on the saucer and stepped outside. The morning mist had thickened into something almost material, softening outlines and muffling voices. Across the street, the boarded windows seemed more an absence than a repair. From the alley beside the shop came the sound of scraping, cautious, uneven. Purbright moved closer and found Mr. Luff crouched near the refuse bin, emptying a small sack of sand into the gutter. The man looked up guiltily, then forced a smile. "Just clearing away the mess, Inspector."
"Nothing sinister. I shouldn't think so," said Purbright mildly.
"Though I can't help noticing you're disposing of it rather far from your shop." Mr. Luff's smile tightened. "Superstition, perhaps. My assistant? Well, she had odd notions about relics and dust. Wouldn't have the stuff indoors. Hilda Wayne, yes? She wasn't at the counter when I passed yesterday." The man hesitated. "No, she's taken a few days. Family matter, I believe." "I'm sorry to hear it." Purbright's tone conveyed neither disbelief nor acceptance.
"Strange thing, glass.
So fragile, yet it keeps its secrets longer than people do." Mr. Luff gave a short, humourless laugh.
"You'll find no secrets in my establishment, Inspector."
"Only curiosities." Purbright looked past him to the shadowed interior. Rows of clocks, barometers, and ship's instruments stared back, each recording, in its own way, the slow progress of time. The detective's eyes lingered on a brass compass missing its needle. "Curious indeed," he said softly. "I'll not keep you from your sweeping, Mr. Luff. Though if Miss Wayne returns, do ask her to call in at the station."
"Merely routine." The man nodded quickly, relief showing like perspiration.
Purbright walked on, hands clasped behind his back. The church bell resumed its testing, 3 slow notes before silence reclaimed it. By evening, the gossip had matured into certainty. The hourglass was cursed. It had belonged, according to Miss Teatree's improved version, to a sea captain's widow who used it to summon her husband's ghost. The captain, dissatisfied, had turned violent from beyond the veil. Mr. Luff, for his part, kept his shop closed, claiming repairs. Yet lights were seen after midnight through the gaps in the boarding. And once, according to the milkman, a woman's silhouette passed behind the curtain. Purbright, at home, poured himself a modest whisky and unfolded the Flaxborough Citizen. The headline concerned the council's plan to repaint the bandstand, but the smaller column below caught his eye. Local oddity destroyed in mishap. He read the brief account twice, noting the phrasing, the object reportedly struck by a passing stone. There was no mention of witnesses. He placed the paper aside, set down his glass and listened. Through the open window came the faint ticking of his mantel clock, steady and unhurried. He found himself glancing at it, measuring its rhythm against some inner pulse that would not quite align. In Flaxborough, time had always behaved itself, yet tonight it seemed to breathe. Purbright rose, extinguished the lamp, and stood in the dim light for a moment longer than reason required. Somewhere across the town, a single bell struck 9, once, twice, then faltered into silence. He smiled faintly. Poor timing, he murmured, and went to bed. The next morning came in thin strips of light across the high street, the sort that failed to commit fully to being sunshine. Flaxborough was slow to wake, though the mist had thinned enough to reveal the boarded window of Luff's curiosity shop, looking pale and embarrassed among its cleaner neighbours. Inspector Purbright, hat set neatly upon his head, walked the length of the pavement with the measured pace of a man neither hurried nor idle. His shoes made a soft, hollow rhythm against the paving stones. When he reached the shop, he paused, long enough to notice a faint glimmer of movement behind the half-lowered blind. He opened the door. The small brass bell above it gave a restrained tinkle, as though uncertain of its duties after yesterday's excitement. The air inside was heavy with varnish and something older, the scent of cloth that had been stored too long beside forgotten metals. "Good morning," Purbright said quietly. Mr. Luff emerged from behind a display case. His spectacles caught the light, obscuring his eyes. "Inspector," he replied, attempting brightness. "You find me in disarray, I'm afraid. The glass, the sand, such a business."
"I've not yet recovered from the tidying." Purbright removed his hat, turning it lightly in his hands.
"I'd say the town has recovered on your behalf. They've moved on to a far livelier scandal concerning a lost cat." Luff gave a short, nervous laugh.
That's Flaxborough for you."
"Ever resourceful in the imagination." He stooped, fumbling with a cabinet door, and Purbright watched the man's fingers. They trembled faintly, not from age, but from something nearer to fatigue. Around him, clocks of every shape stood in silence. Not one was wound. "Curious," Purbright murmured. "How your collection keeps such perfect harmony, all quiet together." "Repairs pending," Luff replied quickly. "I prefer not to have them ticking. Distracting when one's counting stock," Purbright smiled. "Yes, a chorus of punctuality could be oppressive." He stepped closer to a counter where a small pile of papers sat. Among them was a note in delicate handwriting. A woman's, likely.
Only the first line was visible. "I cannot bear the sound any longer." He looked away without comment.
"You had an assistant, I believe. Miss Wayne?" Luff froze for a moment too long.
Yes, Hilda. She's taken leave."
"Her sister in Newark isn't well, so she's gone to assist." Purbright nodded slowly.
"How considerate."
"And yet she didn't collect her wages."
"There's a sealed envelope in your drawer, I think." Luff blinked behind his glasses.
"You seem well informed, Inspector. The constable who helped with your window mentioned it. He has an eye for such things. I suppose you'll post it to her?" Yes. "Once I have her address confirmed." "Of course." Purbright's tone remained mild, conversational. "Though I wonder, had she said anything about returning? Or did she leave suddenly?" It was all rather quick."
Emotional creature.
"She was upset about the accident." Purbright tilted his head.
"Accident?"
"The hourglass, of course. She blamed herself for it falling. She'd moved it earlier that day. Ah. Purbright's eyes wandered to the corner display where a small patch of unpolished wood marked the absent relic. So it was she who last touched it? I suppose so, yes. Luff turned away, wiping his hands on a cloth already grey with dust. But it's quite finished with now. The insurance fellow came this morning. I'd rather not have it discussed further. Bad for trade. Purbright smiled faintly, though his gaze drifted to the floor. Near the counter, where the boards met the wall, a thin line of sand traced a gentle curve toward a locked drawer. It glimmered faintly in the half-light, like the last remnants of a tide. He crouched slightly, studying it without comment. You do keep a tidy establishment, Mr. Luff. Still, this one corner seems reluctant to cooperate. Luff followed his gaze and blanched.
Ah, yes, I've not yet swept there. Old joints in the flooring, you see.
Things fall through.
I mean, dust and such. Purbright rose, brushing his knees.
Perfectly natural. Though if I may, that's not common dust. It's the same fine sand used in old-timer glasses, isn't it? The man's reply came too swiftly. Possibly. I've handled so many trinkets over the years that one loses track. Purbright nodded, satisfied with the answer, though his expression betrayed no judgment. He wandered toward a glass case containing various oddities. A pocket compass, a tarnished telescope, a pair of spectacles with one lens missing. Each bore a small card written in Luff's careful hand. He stopped before a brass clock shaped like a ship's wheel. An attractive piece, he said. Does it work? Luff hesitated.
It used to.
The mechanism's temperamental, like people, Purbright murmured. We tick only when wound correctly. The bell above the door rang suddenly, not with the polite tinkle of entrance, but with a shrillness that startled them both. A gust of cold air swept in, rattling a hanging mirror. No one entered. The door stood ajar, moving slightly in the draught. Old hinges, Luff muttered. Purbright closed it gently. They seem younger than most of your collection. He replaced his hat. Well, I shan't take more of your morning, but do tell Miss Wayne when she returns that she left the town somewhat bereft of conversation. Flaxborough likes a familiar face behind its mysteries. Luff attempted a smile, which faltered halfway. I'll be sure to mention it. Outside, the street was quiet. Purbright paused beneath the hanging sign, its lettering faintly faded by years of weather. The fog had returned, not heavy, but enough to blur the sharp edges of the world. He looked down the street toward the church spire, half swallowed by the pale air, and heard again the ghost of a toll that never quite completed its chime. Behind him, through the shop's drawn blinds, a faint scraping began, the sound of a drawer being forced softly, as though by someone afraid of being heard. Purbright stood still for a moment, listening. Then, without turning back, he continued down the pavement, his steps quiet and regular. In his pocket, his fingers found the small envelope he had lifted unnoticed from the counter, the one addressed, in fine handwriting, to Miss Hilda Wayne. He did not open it. Not yet. Some truths, he knew, told their time without help. The fog closed around him as the church clock struggled once more to find its voice. By the next morning, the town had decided to be sensible again. The Flaxborough Citizen, with its usual blend of brisk reassurance and mild error, printed a small column halfway down page 3. Vandalism in Market Street, curio shop, damaged. The article, framed neatly between an advert for cough mixture and a notice about a church jumble sale, explained that a group of passing youths had likely thrown a stone, shattering the window and an antique ornament inside. The police, it said, had no reason to suspect foul play. This, naturally, was a relief to everyone. By noon, the talk of curses and ghosts had evaporated as quickly as the morning mist. The town preferred its mysteries explained by something it could scold. Even Miss Teatree, who had been chief architect of the supernatural version, now declared herself entirely vindicated. Young people, she told anyone within range, have no respect for the fragility of glass or of history. None at all. She said this again over tea that afternoon, with Inspector Purbright seated across from her in the parlour of her narrow, over-curtained house. The air was sweet with the scent of strong tea and mothballs. On the wall hung a portrait of a dog long dead, looking vaguely alarmed. Purbright stirred his cup thoughtfully.
An improvement, don't you think?
To have a culprit without the bother of evidence. Miss Teatree smiled tightly. You'll forgive the press, Inspector. They must comfort the public somehow.
And really, who else could it have been?
He considered this, eyes on the steam rising from his cup. Indeed.
One imagines that a boy with a catapult must have excellent aim and no instinct for self-preservation. Why so?
Because he would need to throw from very near the window. The mark of impact was inside the glass, not out. Miss Teatree blinked, uncertain whether she had heard correctly.
Inside?
Purbright nodded mildly. The fracture begins from the inner curve and travels outward.
That's why the sand fell inward, not toward the street, she frowned.
But surely glass can break any which way. There are vibrations and, weather, possibly, Purbright said, smiling. Flaxborough's climate is known for its enthusiasm. Still, the explanation seems rather neat, don't you think? Her mouth tightened. You mean convenient? He sipped his tea, neither confirming nor denying. The silence that followed was filled by the faint tick of her mantel clock, which lagged half a minute behind its chime. Miss Teatree watched him, curiosity beginning to override indignation. You don't believe the newspaper account, then? I've always admired the press for its optimism, said Purbright. It has a touching faith in coincidence, and yet no one has produced the stone. Nor has any youth confessed, which is unusual, as most are eager for notoriety when their work is noticed. He set down his cup and rose, wandering to the window. Outside, the afternoon light lay thinly across the rooftops, colouring the slates with a faint pewter glow. Somewhere in the distance, a train moved, the sound low and tired. Miss Teatree followed his gaze. Do you think it was deliberate, then? Some act of spite? I think, he said quietly, that an hourglass rarely breaks by accident. They're made to withstand the clumsiness of centuries. Then what caused it? She asked. Purbright smiled, looking faintly amused. That, Miss Teatree, is what makes life tolerably interesting. He thanked her for the tea, declined a second slice of Battenberg, and took his leave. Outside the air was mild, the street newly washed by a brief shower. He walked slowly back toward the station, his steps matching the unhurried rhythm of thought. In the shop windows he passed, reflections moved like ghosts, the faces of townsfolk nodding, smiling, greeting him with comfortable affection. Flaxborough was content again, and that, he suspected, was its most revealing state. At the station, the sergeant looked up from a crossword. Morning's news clears that one up neatly, sir.
Youths again. Always is, Purbright smiled. Indeed.
A national resource, our vandals. Wouldn't mind having them for all our unsolveds, the sergeant said cheerfully. Purbright leaned on the edge of his desk. Quite. A pity, though, that our particular band of hooligans neglected to leave their stone behind, the sergeant blinked. Stone, sir? The projectile that supposedly struck Mr. Luff's window? Oh, well, and it could have bounced away, couldn't it? Could have. Though there's rather a lot of glass on the inside floor and none outside, which is a curious effect for a stone travelling from the street. The sergeant scratched his head.
Now you mention it, odd.
Still, if no one's complaining, I suppose it'll fade like the rest. Purbright smiled faintly. Yes, time does tidy things most efficiently. As the sergeant returned to his crossword, Purbright unfolded the small envelope he had taken from the curio shop's counter. He did so slowly, as though reluctant to disturb it. Inside was a folded note on thin paper. The handwriting, neat but hurried, read, Mr. Luff, I cannot bear the sound any longer. The ticking, the counting, the waiting.
I shall have to stop it before it stops me.
Forgive me, please. No signature. Purbright replaced the note carefully, returned it to the envelope, and slipped it into the file marked Luff Miscellaneous. Outside, the church bells struck the hour. He looked toward it through the window, a single, calm chime that hung in the air longer than it should have, echoing faintly down Market Street. He sat back, fingers steepled, expression thoughtful, but not grim. Then, with a small, private smile, he murmured to himself. And yet, the glass broke from within. The afternoon passed with the slow composure of habit. Flaxborough, reassured by its newspaper's tidy summary, had resumed its domestic hum. Curtains twitched, kettles sang, and time, or so it appeared, had returned to its proper course. Yet Purbright, seated at his desk, found the rhythm faintly false. The town's pulse was steady, yes, but it beat over something unsaid. The note from the curio shop lay before him, folded once more into its envelope, a pale ghost against the wood grain. He turned it over idly, noticing the faintest smear of ink along one edge,
as though a tear-dew or perhaps a raindrop had blurred the final word.
The act of reading it had altered it somehow. It no longer seemed merely a cry of distress. There was intent in the phrasing. I shall have to stop it before it stops me. The sergeant appeared in the doorway, holding a paper by its corner. Something's come in, sir. Postmaster found this behind a sorting drawer, unstamped, must have slipped through last collection. Purbright took the letter carefully. It was addressed in the same fine looping hand to Miss Clara Wayne, 14 Church Lane, Newark. The postmark box was empty. He opened it with quiet deliberation. The writing was small and slightly uneven, as though hurried by someone unsure of her own courage. Dearest Clara, he says it will all be right soon, that I must trust him, as the sands will turn again and time forgive us both. But he speaks in riddles, and I fear what the old man's promise truly means. The ticking has grown louder these past nights, though no clock moves in the house. If I can, I'll come to you before it stops altogether. Love H. Purbright read it twice, then folded it neatly. This was found today? Yes, sir. Must have been lodged there a week, maybe 2. Purbright rose, pocketing the letter. Mr. Luff has an old house on Barrow Lane, doesn't he? That's right.
Lives above the shop's storage rooms.
Alone since his wife passed. Since his wife passed, Purbright repeated softly, as if testing the phrase for soundness. Let's have a look, shall we? Barrow Lane sloped gently away from the town centre, lined with narrow terraces that had been respectable when gaslight was new, and had since grown into their own tired dignity. The Luff house stood halfway down, narrow, tall, and too symmetrical for comfort. A curtain shifted as Purbright approached. He knocked. The sound echoed faintly as though travelling farther than it should. After a pause, Mr. Luff opened the door. He looked smaller than before, his composure frayed by the dim hallway behind him.
Inspector, again?
Only briefly, Purbright said pleasantly. I won't disturb you long.
May I come in?
Luff hesitated, then stepped aside. If you must. The hallway smelled faintly of polish and damp paper. Along one wall hung several clocks, all stopped at different hours, their faces dulled by dust. A grandfather clock at the far end stood silent, pendulum motionless. I see you collect even at home, Purbright observed lightly. Reminders of work, I suppose, Luff said. His tone was brisk, defensive. You'd be surprised how often people bring time into their troubles. On the contrary, Purbright murmured. I've made something of a study of it myself. He followed Luff into a narrow sitting room. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a diffused grey light. Against the wall stood a writing desk, neatly ordered, except for a space in the centre where dust had been disturbed. Purbright's gaze lingered on it. Expecting a letter? He asked. Luff blinked.
No, why do you ask?
An impression, said Purbright. The absence of something often speaks louder than its presence. He turned, letting his eyes travel over the mantelpiece. 2 framed photographs stood there, One of a woman with a serene, distant smile, the other of the same woman, older, holding a child, who could only be Hilda Wayne. She worked here once, didn't she? Purbright asked gently. Luff's jaw tightened.
Years ago.
Before she came back to assist in the shop. You've known her some time then. I knew her mother better. Purbright nodded slowly, noting the phrasing.
And her father?
Died young. Consumption, I believe. The detective moved closer to the photographs. The light from the window caught the glass, and for a moment he saw his own reflection mingled with theirs. 3 faces sharing one brief frame. Tell me, Mr. Luff, he said quietly, what did you mean when you told her the sands would turn again? The man's head jerked.
I what?
Your phrase, not mine. She used it in her letter. Luff's lips parted, then closed again.
I've no idea what you're talking about. Purbright regarded him steadily.
The postmaster found it this morning.
An unsent letter to her sister. Colour drained from Luff's face. Then she wrote again? Recently?
Recently enough. The tone suggests unease.
Fear, even? Luff turned away, gripping the mantle.
She misunderstood.
I only meant that. Well, that time eases guilt, doesn't it?
She was troubled by her mother's things. She imagined, oh nonsense, that the old clocks carried something of her past. I told her to let it go. And yet, said Purbright softly, you kept them. Luff's shoulders sagged. Habit, sentiment, choose whichever sounds less foolish. A clock ticked faintly upstairs in a single, deliberate sound. Purbright raised his head.
That one works. What? Oh, the bedroom clock. Keeps terrible time, 6 minutes fast. Purbright's expression didn't change.
Still it ticks. He climbed the narrow stairs without waiting for invitation. The room above was plain, cold, and half-lit. On the dressing table stood a small silver clock, its hands fixed on 4:12, though the ticking continued, steady and wrong. He bent close. The rhythm faltered once, then resumed. The sound, he realized, wasn't from the clock at all, but from behind the wall. He straightened slowly. You've had work done here, haven't you? Luff appeared in the doorway, his face pale. A repair, nothing more. Strange repair, Purbright said. He pressed a hand against the wallpaper, a faint hollow beneath. Sound travels oddly through plaster. It's an old house, Luff murmured. Purbright looked at him for a long moment, the silence lengthening until it became almost kind. Yes, he said at last. Old houses keep things. He turned back to the clock, wound it once, and listened as it resumed its false heartbeat. Then with the faintest sigh he set it down again. 6 minutes fast, he repeated softly. Enough, perhaps, to give one the illusion that time hasn't yet caught up. As he left, the ticking followed him down the stairs. Quiet, persistent, and somehow pleading. The following day carried a brittle stillness, like paper held too near a flame. Flaxborough moved through its ordinary motions, the chime of the post office door, the slow drift of bicycles past the greengrocer. But the rhythm faltered, faintly out of step. Purbright felt it as he walked, the sense of lives quietly rearranging themselves around something unspoken. He began, as he often did, with tea. The station kettle wheezed and sighed. The sergeant shuffled papers with an eagerness that suggested avoidance. When Purbright asked after Mr. Luff, the man brightened. Oh, he's been about, sir. Called in to report the insurance settled. Said he'd reopen the shop tomorrow. Good. I should hate for commerce to suffer on account of metaphysics. The sergeant looked puzzled as usual, but Purbright's gaze was already elsewhere. He had laid out before him 2 letters, the one to Clara Wayne, and another recently discovered among Mrs. Poole's discarded papers. The widow, in her frequent tidying, had sent a bundle of old correspondence to the charity sale, where one curious volunteer recognized the handwriting and brought it to the station. Purbright compared the 2. The hand was the same, though the tone differed. Dear Mrs. Poole, he tells me your husband's soul lingers in the object, that when the sand ceases, so too will his unrest. I thought it wicked at first to trade in grief, but perhaps kindness sometimes looks like deceit. If it brings you peace, I can bear it." The inspector set the letter down with a small sigh. The pattern had begun to show itself, faint but undeniable. The widow's yearning, Hilda's guilt, Luff's commerce. A triangle, yes, but one drawn in sympathy rather than malice. By mid-afternoon, he found himself once again in Market Street. The curio shop stood open now, sunlight catching the edges of its freshly cleaned window. Inside, the dust had been banished, and Mr. Luff, dressed with careful propriety, was arranging his displays. "Inspector," he said, too quickly.
"You see, I've restored order."
I thought best to move on from, recent misunderstandings. "Always wise," Purbright agreed. "Although I'm afraid misunderstandings, like debts, have a way of renewing themselves." Luff's smile flickered.
"I hope not." Purbright's gaze drifted to the shelves.
Clocks, compasses, lockets, each tagged and labelled in neat, faded script. Yet now he saw a pattern in their descriptions that had escaped him before. Widow's keepsake, seafarer's compass, captain's mirror, each tied to loss. "You've a talent for sentiment," he said mildly. "Or for marketing," Luff stiffened. "People find comfort in the idea that objects remember." "Yes," Purbright murmured, "though one wonders who first told them so." Silence stretched. The ticking of a single clock, not wound, yet ticking, filled the gap. Luff sank onto a stool.
"It began harmlessly enough.
I buy small things from estate sales, trinkets no one wanted. But then people came asking for proof that what they'd lost still touched the world, and it was easy to give them a story." "Mrs. Poole?"
"She was the first." His voice trembled.
"Her husband drowned off Whitby. I told her the hourglass had belonged to a sailor's wife, that the sand within marked not time, but distance. When it stopped, she said she dreamt of him smiling." Purbright regarded him with quiet compassion. "And Hilda?" Luff's hands tightened. "She discovered the deception."
"Said it was cruel."
"I told her it was mercy, but she believed me worse than a thief. She helped me choose the relics, you see. Her conscience became unbearable. And so she wrote to her sister," Purbright said softly, "about the old man's promise. You, I presume." A hollow nod. "She said you told her the sands would turn again." "I meant forgiveness," Luff whispered. "That she must let the past move."
"But she thought I meant resurrection. That I'd trapped something in the glass." Purbright's eyes moved to the empty stand in the window, where the hourglass had once stood.
Perhaps she was right in her way. The past has a habit of remaining trapped until someone breaks the glass. Luff looked up sharply, but Purbright's tone held no accusation, only quiet understanding. "And the widow?" the inspector asked. "She returned the next day asking for her money back. Said she no longer dreamt of her husband." The sand had stopped. Purbright's brows rose slightly. "And what did you tell her?" "I said it meant he'd found peace." "And did you believe it?" Luff hesitated. "I think I wanted to." Outside, a faint tapping began. Rain against the window pane, soft and irregular. Purbright watched the droplets slide down the glass, merging and parting like moments reluctant to let go. "You realize," he said quietly, "that what you sold wasn't superstition, Mr. Luff. It was hope. The most expensive item in Flaxborough, and you gave it freely until someone asked for a receipt." Luff gave a broken laugh. "Is that what this is, Inspector? Philosophy in place of law?" "Law seldom applies cleanly to kindness," Purbright said. He turned toward the door. "Though it does have a way of asking where the missing have gone." The words hung in the air.
Luff said nothing.
Only the faint ticking continued. One clock among dozens, all silent. As Purbright stepped outside, the first bell from the church tower began its hour's chime. He paused, listening. The tone was deeper than usual, resonant, as if the air itself remembered something. Across the street, Mrs. Poole was standing in her doorway, hands clasped around a folded handkerchief. Their eyes met briefly. She gave a faint nod, not of greeting, but of surrender. Purbright returned it with a gentleness that made it almost a blessing. Then he walked on, the rain deepening, the sound of his shoes blending with the slow rhythm of the bells. Somewhere behind him, in the dim light of the curio shop, a man sat surrounded by his quiet clocks, listening to the one that refused to stop. Midnight arrived as a suggestion rather than an event, the sort of hour that slips quietly through curtains and into corners, drawing the town into its uncertain hush. Flaxborough slept in that peculiar half-peace known only to places convinced of their own innocence. And then the clock began to toll. It started with a hesitant note, like the clearing of a long-neglected throat. Then another, clearer, reverberating through the mist-soaked streets. 12 strokes in all, deliberate and sonorous, rolling across rooftops and down chimneys, stirring curtains and dogs alike. No one, as far as anyone could recall, had wound the church clock for a week. By the third chime, lamps flickered to life in bedroom windows. By the fifth, doors opened. By the 12th, Market Street was dotted with dressing gowns and overcoats hastily thrown over nightclothes, faces upturned toward the dark tower. At the edge of the square, Inspector Purbright stood very still, his hat brim catching the faint drizzle. He'd been awake already. Sleep these nights seemed reluctant to settle upon him. The sound had drawn him from his armchair. Coat pulled over pajamas, and now he listened. The way one listens to a confession made in another room. The final chime lingered, its echo curling around the stones of the church like a fading argument. Then silence, profound and absolute. Miss Teatrey's voice, brittle with indignation, rose from the gathering gloom.
"Well, if that isn't blasphemous, I don't know what is."
A clock that chimes itself.
"I said all along this town was ripe for judgment. Someone muttered something about wind pressure, another about pranksters."
The theories multiplied quickly, as they always did in Flaxborough, the town's own method of exorcism. Purbright let them murmur. His gaze had fixed on the tower, faintly visible through the fog, the outline blurred but familiar. The clock face glowed weakly in the mist, its hands unmoving. Yet the echo of its chime still vibrated faintly in the air, as though time itself had decided to reassert its presence. He walked slowly toward the church gates. The iron was cold beneath his glove. The great doors stood closed but unlocked, as they often were, in small towns, still confident in divine supervision. Inside, the air was still, carrying that mingled scent of stone, wax, and long prayer. His footsteps echoed gently as he crossed the nave. Near the front pew, the verger, Mr. Cudby, appeared, pale and blinking, his nightcap a little crooked.
"Inspector?"
"Good heavens, sir, you gave me a turn. You heard it too, then?" "I should be concerned if I hadn't," said Purbright mildly.
"Do you often keep such melodious hours?"
"Never, sir. The mechanism's been still for days. I was meant to wind it last Friday, only the key's gone missing. Took it home by mistake, I think, and, well, Mrs. Cudby's misplaced it." Purbright looked up at the dark interior of the tower. "So the clock wound itself," the verger swallowed. "Seems that way, sir. Could be the weight slipped, though I've never known that cause proper chimes." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured. "Or perhaps something found its balance again." Outside, the fog pressed closer, turning the lamplight into pale halos. A few townsfolk still lingered in the square, unwilling to go home until someone of authority declared the night safe for sleep. Purbright gave them a gentle nod and said, "You'll find nothing sinister in punctuality, I promise. Time merely remembered us for a moment." They dispersed reluctantly, their whispers soft as the receding mist. He remained, leaning against the low wall that bordered the churchyard. Somewhere beyond, water dripped steadily from the guttering, a slow, deliberate rhythm that might almost have been an echo of the clock's forgotten heart. The irony was not lost on him. One timepiece shattered, another revived. The hourglass and the tower, twin symbols of measurement, one destroyed by guilt, the other awakened by it. He glanced down at the square. Mr. Luff's shop lay in darkness, yet a faint sheen of light trembled behind the upstairs curtain. Not enough for a lamp, more like a candle's nervous flutter. Purbright sighed quietly.
Conscience keeps poor hours, he said to himself. Footsteps approached. Mrs. Poole, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, face pale beneath her bonnet. "Inspector," she whispered. "I couldn't rest. It sounded like my Alfred's old ship bell, the one we had in the garden." Purbright turned to her gently.
"You're not the only one who heard more than a chime, Mrs. Poole." She looked at him helplessly. "Do you think it means something?"
"A sign, perhaps?"
Mr. Luff said. "Well, he said that when time speaks again, it's the past forgiving the living." He studied her face.
"Did he now?"
"Yes. After the accident with the glass, he said it softly like a prayer. I thought he was comforting himself." "Maybe he was," said Purbright. "Sometimes we find absolution only by borrowing the language of ghosts." The fog thickened again, curling around the gravestones like a slow tide. The bell rope swayed faintly inside the tower, though no wind touched it. Purbright's eyes lifted once more to the motionless clock face. "If the dead do forgive us, Mrs. Poole," he said, "they're punctual about it." She gave a trembling smile, uncertain whether to take comfort or warning. He watched her retreat toward her doorway, then lingered until the last lamp was extinguished. Only the faintest light now came from the church, the kind that might have been reflection or memory. He drew his coat tighter and began to walk back toward the station. Footsteps measured, slow, as though matching the deliberate pace of the invisible pendulum overhead. Each echo through the cobblestones carried a thought, forming quietly in his mind. One object destroyed, one restored. The first silenced time to hide guilt. The second resurrected it to speak. Behind him, as he reached the corner of Market Street, the tower released a single, reluctant chime. One stroke, late and low. Purbright stopped. He turned his head slightly toward the sound, then gave a small, rueful smile. "Ah," he murmured, "so not quite forgiven after all." And he walked on into the thinning fog, the echo of that final bell following him like a heartbeat he could not claim as his own. The rain returned by evening, falling with that unhurried persistence which Flaxborough accepted as its natural lullaby. The station windows shimmered with reflections from the single lamp above Purbright's desk, its light softened by the drizzle outside. Inside, time seemed to move at its own discretion. Slower, thoughtful, reluctant. Purbright sat with his pipe cooling beside an untouched cup of tea. Before him lay the open logbook, though its pages remained stubbornly blank beyond a single, patient heading. Luff, Frederick. Ongoing inquiries. The pen rested diagonally across it like a bookmark between thoughts. The sergeant was making his third attempt at the crossword. "Sir," he said finally, "you don't suppose that clock business could be something mechanical, do you? Springs loosening themselves, or wind collecting in the tower?" Purbright smiled faintly. "It would be comforting to believe so, wouldn't it? The notion that all mysteries can be explained by drafts and diligence." The sergeant grunted. "Well, there's comfort in reason. I don't fancy thinking time started a mind of its own." "No," Purbright agreed softly, eyes on the rain-streaked glass. "That would be inconvenient." He leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Do you ever notice, Sergeant, how remorse behaves like a clock?" The man blinked.
"A clock, sir?"
"Yes, it ticks whether you listen or not. Sometimes you wind it by memory, sometimes by silence. And when you think it's stopped altogether, you'll find it chiming in the middle of the night." The sergeant frowned, clearly uncertain whether to nod or apologize. "I can't say I've compared the two, sir." That's because you're sensible, Purbright said mildly. Outside, the wind shifted, and the faint echo of the church bell drifted through the damp air. Not chiming now, merely humming with the memory of its earlier defiance. The sound made its way into the room like a visitor too polite to announce itself. Purbright turned the letter from Hilda over in his hands once more. The paper had softened with handling, the folds now weary from repetition. She wasn't running, he said quietly, half to himself. Everyone assumes a disappearance means flight, but hers feels more like penance. She believed herself responsible for something that refused to die quietly. The sergeant glanced up.
You think she's still nearby?
Purbright's gaze settled on the lamplight trembling across his teacup. Remorse rarely travels far. It prefers familiar furniture, the remark hung between them, and the sergeant, recognizing its tone as one that required no reply, returned to his crossword, the scratching of his pencil faint against the rain. Purbright stood, pacing slowly toward the filing cabinet. He opened the middle drawer, withdrew a folder marked Market Street Incident, and spread its contents neatly across the desk. Photographs, receipts, notes in his own hand, none revealing, yet all somehow connected by a rhythm he could not quite name. He studied the photograph of the shattered hourglass, its pale sand caught mid-fall on the wooden floor. He could almost hear it, the soft hiss of thousands of tiny fragments finding stillness. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured, "how people imagine time as something that passes, when in truth it only collects like dust. The more we stir it, the thicker it settles." The sergeant looked up again. "I beg your pardon, sir?" Purbright's eyes remained on the photo. Mr. Luff thought he was selling comfort, but what he sold was permission to believe that grief can be measured, then ended. Mrs. Poole bought peace, and Miss Wayne bought guilt. He, I think, kept both. He gathered the papers, aligning them with the precision of ritual. Each of them made a bargain with time, and time, obliging creature that it is, gave them what they asked, a pause, nothing more. A gust rattled the window pane. The lamplight flickered briefly. The sergeant cleared his throat.
"If you'll forgive me saying, sir, you make it sound as though the whole town's gone queer." Purbright smiled faintly. "Oh, Flaxborough has always been queer, Sergeant."
"We simply dress it better than most." The sergeant returned to his puzzle, chewing on the end of his pencil. "Well, I hope Miss Wayne turns up soon, whatever bargain she made."
"It's unsettling, all this," Purbright nodded absently. "Unsettling, yes."
Though perhaps that's how truth announces itself. Not in thunder, but in small discomforts, like a watch ticking louder after midnight. He closed the folder, extinguished the lamp, and crossed to the window. The reflection of his own face merged with the darkness beyond. The rain had eased into drizzle, and through the thin veil of it he could just make out the shape of the church tower.
No light now, no movement, yet the faintest hum still lingered.
As though the mechanism beneath the clock face breathed in sleep. He thought of Hilda again, of the phrase in her letter, "The sands will turn again." Perhaps she had not meant it as fear, but as faith. The hope that things broken might resume, even if imperfectly. He found the idea oddly moving. "Sir," said the sergeant after a pause, "if time's collecting like dust, as you say, do you think it ever needs a proper cleaning?" Purbright's eyes softened, his smile a whisper.
"Every so often, yes."
"Though one must be careful not to sweep away the evidence." They fell into companionable silence. The only sound was the clock on the wall, steady but fractionally slow. The sergeant yawned. "It feels longer than a day since the glass broke." Purbright turned from the window. "That's because we've been measuring the wrong thing. It isn't the hours that change, Sergeant.
It's what weighs inside them." He moved back to his desk, replaced the file, and straightened the pen across the logbook.
The tea was cold now, the pipe cold too, yet he found both oddly comforting, proof that some things obeyed the simple laws of neglect. The church bell gave one soft toll, not the deep resonance of midnight, but a single uncertain note, like a breath remembered. The sergeant frowned. There it goes again. You'd think it had taken to haunting itself. Purbright looked up, eyes distant but amused. Perhaps it has. Time, Sergeant, has a remarkable sense of mischief. He sat down once more, opened the logbook, and wrote in his careful hand, "Observation. Remorse runs neither forward nor back. It simply remains." Then he underlined it, leaned back in his chair, and listened to the silence resume its shape. Calm, delicate, and faintly expectant, as though waiting for the next chime. Rain lingered through the following afternoon, thin and steady as a memory that refused to fade. By the time Inspector Purbright reached Mrs. Poole's gate, the air had grown heavy with the smell of damp soil and coal smoke. Curtains along the lane stirred faintly. Flaxborough always noticed when the police came calling, though few admitted to watching. He paused on the doorstep before knocking, listening. Within the house came the slow rhythm of a clock, not the tower's solemn toll, but a smaller domestic measure, the kind that marks out lives rather than hours. Mrs. Poole answered at once, as though she'd been waiting just behind the door. She wore a shawl despite the mild air, her face pale and drawn, though her eyes held that steady defiance peculiar to those who fear they have already been forgiven too soon. "Inspector," she said softly, "I'd thought perhaps you'd finished with this matter." "I had hoped so," he replied. "But time, it seems, prefers to repeat its lessons." She stepped aside with a sigh. "You'd best come in, then." The parlour was modest but fastidiously arranged, a lace cloth over the table, a single lamp burning low beside a tray of untouched tea. On the mantel stood an hourglass, tall and intact, the sand pale as frost within its glass throat. Purbright looked at it for a long moment before speaking. "You've replaced it." Mrs. Poole followed his gaze, her hands twisting the edge of her shawl.
"No, that one isn't his."
"I've had it for years, since Alfred passed. I told Mr. Luff about it once, that I couldn't bear to see it move. He said it should run again, that grief needed its measure. But I never wound the clock, and I never turned that glass." Purbright's tone remained calm, almost conversational, and yet here it stands, untouched but never discarded. A curious sort of keeping, wouldn't you say? She gave a faint, pained smile. "You think it's guilt, Inspector?"
"I think it's memory," he said.
"And memory is never precise about its intentions." He moved closer to the hearth. The hourglass caught the firelight, throwing two narrow bands of gold across the wall. The grains within seemed still, though when he leaned closer he noticed they quivered faintly, as if the air itself disturbed them. Mrs. Poole poured tea with hands that shook. The cups clinked gently.
"If you've come to accuse me of anything," she said, "you might as well speak it plain."
"I'm tired of being careful." "And let's be plain," Purbright said kindly. "Miss Wayne never left Flaxborough." The sound of the clock filled the pause that followed. Mrs. Poole's hand froze halfway to her mouth, cup trembling against the saucer.
"That's—" She stopped, her breath catching.
"You can't mean—" "She's upstairs," Purbright continued, his voice as soft as the rain. "I knew when I saw your curtains drawn at midday. The house breathes differently when there's more than one life in it." Mrs. Poole set the cup down very gently. "You've no proof?" Purbright's expression did not change. "Proof is only the echo of truth, Mrs. Poole. I don't require it when the silence is this clear." Tears welled without falling. "She came that night," she whispered, after the glass broke.
"I found her at the back gate, soaked through, trembling, saying she'd ruined everything. She begged me not to tell him, not to tell anyone.
Said she'd heard voices in the sand, her mother's voice, asking to be forgiven." He listened, without interruption. The ticking clock behind her seemed louder now, as if encouraged by confession. "I brought her in," she went on. "She was feverish, half mad with guilt. I meant only to let her rest a night. But when the doctor passed, she begged me not to send him up. She said she deserved the waiting, that the punishment was the sound of time stopping. Then you let her stay, Purbright said. She wouldn't leave, Mrs. Poole murmured. Each day she said she'd go tomorrow.
I couldn't turn her out.
It felt as though I owed her something. Mr. Luff took my grief and made it a sale. Hilda took it back and made it mercy. Purbright regarded her with quiet gravity. You're not wrong, Mrs. Poole, but mercy is a heavy thing when it tries to hide. She drew the shawl tighter, her voice faltering.
I didn't mean for it to become deceit. I only wanted quiet. The quiet we purchase, said Purbright gently, always costs more than we expect. He crossed to the foot of the narrow staircase.
The air on the landing was colder, touched with the faint scent of lavender and dust. Halfway up he paused, listening. There, a shallow breath, followed by the fragile creak of bed springs. Miss Wayne? He called softly. A faint rustle answered him. When he reached the small room beneath the eaves, the door stood slightly ajar. A candle burned on the table beside a narrow bed. Hilda lay there, eyes half open, pale as the linen. Her lips moved, though no sound came. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to the gentleness of habit.
You've been very patient, he said.
But it's time to let the clock wind again. Her gaze flickered toward the window, where the fading light caught the movement of rain on glass.
I broke it, she breathed.
The hourglass. I thought if I stopped it, she'd rest. But it only made the ticking louder. The ticking, Purbright repeated.
Yes, it tends to do that when ignored. I heard it in my dreams, she whispered.
The sands falling, even after it was gone. I thought if I stayed still enough, it would forget me. He laid a hand gently on the bedpost. Time forgets no one, Miss Wayne, but it does forgive eventually, and with less fuss than people do. Her eyes closed. Her breathing steadied. Beneath the candlelight, her features softened into something almost peaceful. When he descended again, Mrs. Poole was standing by the mantel, staring at the hourglass.
Or will you take her away?
She asked. Not tonight, said Purbright. She's ill, not guilty. You've done her no harm, though the law may need persuading of that later. Mrs. Poole nodded faintly. Then I'll keep her warm till morning. He looked once more at the hourglass, still unturned, the sand waiting patiently. That one, he said, you might set moving again. It's no good keeping time still. It only grows stubborn. She hesitated, then reached out, turning the glass over. The sand began its slow descent, silent, luminous in the firelight. Purbright smiled. There, order restored more or less. As he opened the door to leave, the rain had ceased. The air beyond smelled of wet stone and chimney smoke, and somewhere distant, a single bell marked the hour. He stood for a moment, listening to the sound fade through the mist. One clock silenced by guilt, another awakened by remorse. And here, in this small house, both still ticking. He touched the brim of his hat, murmuring almost to himself. In the end, it seems time was never broken, only borrowed. And with that, he stepped into the quiet street, leaving the faint glow of Mrs. Poole's window behind him, where two women and one hourglass measured forgiveness, grain by gentle grain. Morning arrived in a hush of pale gold and thin fog. The rain had left the cobblestones slick, reflecting the soft blue of the waking sky. Flaxborough, always quick to smooth its conscience, looked freshly laundered, as though the night's sorrows had been neatly folded away with the damp. An ambulance stood discreetly outside Mrs. Poole's house. Its engine idled softly, a respectful murmur rather than intrusion. Purbright stood by the gate, hat in hand, watching as the constable guided Hilda Wayne down the narrow path. She was wrapped in Mrs. Poole's shawl, her face turned toward the morning light. Fragile, but calm now, like someone who had stopped running in a dream. She'll rest now, Mrs. Poole said from the doorway. Her eyes were swollen from weeping, but her voice carried the faint steadiness of purpose. She will, Purbright replied.
And so I think will you, the woman smiled. a small, rueful gesture, barely visible.
"You'll make your report, I suppose?" "Yes," he said, "but I'll be brief. There's little virtue in repetition, even for the record." He watched the ambulance turn the corner and vanish into the thinning mist, its sound dwindling until only the church clock remained, ticking faintly, for once in proper rhythm. By mid-morning, Purbright found himself back in Market Street. Luff's curiosity shop stood open again, but stripped of its sentiment. The shelves were half empty, the window bare save for a discreet notice: liquidation sale, genuine relics, genuine regret. Inside, Mr. Luff sat behind the counter, shoulders bowed, spectacles resting uselessly on the open ledger before him. The familiar precision had deserted his hands. His fingers idly turned the pages as if hoping the sums might rearrange themselves into mercy. Purbright approached quietly. "You made a decision, then?" Luff nodded without lifting his eyes.
"I'm closing."
"There's no more market for nostalgia once people see what it costs. The insurance will barely cover the debts." "A misfortune," said Purbright, "but not the worst sort." Luff gave a thin smile. "No, bankruptcy is an honest punishment. It leaves the soul more or less intact." He looked up finally, his gaze uncertain. "How is she?" "Alive," said Purbright. "She'll recover given time." "You both might." The man exhaled, a sound between relief and defeat.
"I never meant harm, Inspector."
"Truly, I thought stories eased suffering. What's a harmless fiction against grief?" Purbright considered him for a moment. "Harmless fictions," he said, "have a curious way of discovering their truth. You sold comfort, Mr. Luff, but you charged in hope, and that's a currency few can afford." Luff bowed his head. "Then I've no defence." "Good," Purbright said gently. "Defence spoils remorse." He turned to go, pausing at the door. "You might find when all this has ended that you've learned something rather valuable." Luff looked up, weary but curious. "And what's that?" "That forgiveness," said Purbright, "isn't given.
It's endured." The bell above the door tinkled softly as he stepped out into the street.
The air was warming now, sunlight edging through the last tatters of fog. Across the square the church tower glinted faintly, its clock newly repaired.
Hands aligned and polished to brightness. At noon.
It chimed precisely on time. Back at the station, Purbright sat at his desk, the light from the high window laying a pale rectangle across his papers. The kettle burbled on the small stove. The sergeant, tactful as ever, pretended to find purpose in the day's correspondence. The inspector wrote slowly, the nib of his pen whispering across the page. His report was concise, clinical in its outline, discreet in its omissions. Subject H. Wayne, female, 26. Removed to Flaxborough Infirmary. Condition stable. Mr. F. Luff, cooperating. No criminal proceedings recommended. Recommendation. File closed. Incident domestic in nature. He paused before the last line, the ink gathering faintly at the tip of his pen. Then beneath it he wrote, "It seems that time, once disturbed, punishes most gently by continuing." He blotted the words, folded the paper, and slid it into the file marked Luff, Miscellaneous. The folder joined its companions in the cabinet with a soft click, another secret neatly stored among a town's careful silences. The sergeant appeared in the doorway, holding a mug. "Tea's ready, sir." Purbright accepted it with a nod.
"Thank you, Sergeant."
"A day for reflection, I think?" "Yes, sir." "About the clock business. The vergers wound it proper now." "Run smooth as you like."
Even said it sounds different.
"Brighter," he called it. "Ha ha," said Purbright, sipping thoughtfully. "Then we may assume absolution has been achieved." The sergeant frowned.
"Absolution, sir?"
"A form of maintenance," Purbright replied. "Keeps the works from rusting." He smiled faintly and turned to the window. Outside, the square was alive again. Children running past the fountain, the postman whistling, the world performing its ordinary acts of forgetting. The church bell struck once, clear and certain, and the sound hung over the rooftops like a held breath. Purbright finished his tea, set down the cup, and opened his watch. The hands moved steadily, obediently. He closed it again with a quiet click, satisfied. In the silence that followed, the faintest echo of that single chime seemed still to linger, as though even time itself, briefly chastened, wished to be polite. Afternoon sunlight lay across the square in pale ribbons, catching the steam from teacups and the slow turning of bicycle wheels. Flaxborough had, as it always did, resumed its familiar rhythm, that careful choreography of errands, gossip, and civility that disguised so much unspoken relief. The shop windows gleamed anew, the puddles had dried, and the scent of bread drifted once more from the baker's doorway, as though nothing at all had been disturbed. Inside the police station, the world moved even more slowly. The single clock above the sergeant's desk ticked with quiet satisfaction, its hands steady now, untroubled by mystery. The only other sound was the faint rattle of a window pane in the mild breeze. On the sill beneath it sat the hourglass. It was smaller than the one that had shattered in Mr. Luff's shop, its brass frame unassuming, the glass clean and narrow. The sand within was pale, almost white, and it fell in a thin, unhurried stream that seemed to hush the room rather than fill it. A small card, written in neat script, leaned against its base, for Inspector Purbright, with gratitude and remembrance, Monsieur Poole. Purbright sat at his desk, writing with his usual deliberate hand. His report on the final matter of Miss Wayne had been completed and dispatched that morning. What remained before him now was no more than routine correspondence, minor civic complaints, licensing renewals, a proposal to repaint the station door. But his eyes, every so often, lifted toward the window and the steady fall of sand. The sergeant, sorting through a tray of telegrams, glanced across. "Fine thing, that," he said, nodding toward the hourglass. "Makes the place look civilized." Purbright smiled faintly. "That, Sergeant, is precisely what Mrs. Poole intended. She believes civilization consists chiefly of objects that know how to behave. Still," the sergeant continued, "it's a queer reminder, isn't it?"
"After all that's happened." "On the contrary," Purbright said.
"It's an ideal one. Time-contained, visible, and well-mannered. A comfort to those who mistrust the invisible kind." The sergeant grunted, half in agreement, and returned to his papers. Outside, the bell of St. Mark's chimed the quarter hour, a modest sound, perfectly punctual. Purbright set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. He thought briefly of Mr. Luff, now vanished from Market Street, of the shuttered shop, its windows papered, its shelves gone to auction, of Hilda Wayne recovering under white sheets in the infirmary, where she had begun to speak again, though in half-whispered sentences about dreams and forgiveness, and of Mrs. Poole, who had sent the hourglass with her note, a small symbol of gratitude and of something far more difficult to name. He reached out and turned the glass. The sound of shifting sand was barely audible. A sigh, perhaps, or the smallest exhalation of life continuing. "I sometimes think," he said after a moment, "that time only moves for those who watch it. The rest of us drift and call it living." The sergeant, untroubled by philosophy, nodded politely.
"Aye, still it keeps things tidy." Purbright's smile deepened. "Indeed."
"Tidiness is Flaxborough's most enduring virtue." He turned back to his paperwork, the nib of his pen whispering softly across the page. The minutes stretched, unremarkable, yet companionable, marked only by the muted hiss of sand descending in its narrow chamber. Outside, the town performed its quiet acts of restoration. Children chalked hopscotch squares on the pavement. Mr. Swithers adjusted his signboard for the evening edition. Miss Tea-Tree paused before the florist's window, considering whether a pot of begonias might lend moral improvement to her doorstep. Every movement, every gesture seemed guided by an instinctive desire to reassure, to reassert that Flaxborough, Whatever small disturbances visited it would always resume its shape. The clock on the station wall struck the hour. Purbright looked up, then at the hourglass, where the last grains had gathered neatly at the base. He turned it once more, almost absently, as though unwilling to let it rest. "There," he murmured. "No arrests, no scandal, no fuss.
Only the slow correction of things." The sergeant, gathering his coat, paused at the door.
"Funny how it all worked out, sir. Like time fixed itself," Purbright considered. "Perhaps, or perhaps it simply forgave our impatience." The younger man frowned.
"I'm not sure I follow." "That's quite all right," said Purbright.
"Neither does time, most days." When the sergeant had gone, the inspector remained a while longer, listening to the town's muffled evening hum beyond the window. Somewhere distant, the church bell rang again. Not portentous this time, but content, as though marking not hours, but the comfort of their passing. Purbright looked once more at the hourglass. The sand, mid-fall, caught the dying sunlight, turning gold in the glass. For a moment, the streams seemed to hang suspended, time pausing just long enough to be noticed. Then it continued, slow and certain, its rhythm unbroken. He closed his ledger, folded his spectacles, and stood. The last light of day reached across the floorboards, touching the hourglass, the desk, and the man who watched them both with quiet satisfaction. Outside, the sound of laughter drifted faintly from the square. Ordinary, unremarkable, and wholly human, Inspector Purbright smiled.
"Ah," he said softly. "Punctual as ever." And with that, he turned down the lamp, leaving only the glimmer of sand still falling in the dark.
Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.